Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 42. I'm your host, Barney Smith of Storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the highly regarded and acclaimed author of Granite Kingdom, Eric Pope.
Thank you, Barney.
Hey, Eric, how you doing?
I'm doing fine.
And so this book came out, Granite Kingdom. It came out in last November 2022, and it is now available to purchase where you can buy wherever books are sold. You can get it from your local bookstore. You can get it from any online bookstore publishings. You can also get it if you're so inclined to buy it off of Rootstock Publishing. So we'll probably talk near the end, but you also got the bug. Now you're writing a second book called The Macedonian Sun.
Correct. Oh, you've done your homework. Yes. Well, that's actually the first book that I wrote, but it's been a lot harder, a lot longer road to get it published. I have a publishing contract that I signed last summer. I was just notified a couple of weeks ago that it won't come out until spring of 2025.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Which is very, that's almost 3 years. Rootstock, I am glad to say I signed the contract in November of 2021 and it came out a year later.
Right. That's amazing.
And so, I thought that was a long time, but I understand now that it's not. And
yeah,
I'm very grateful that it came out as soon as it did.
And I gotta say, like, somebody who is, from Vermont, and I really understand that everybody knows about Rock of Ages quarry. Everybody knows about Barre, Vermont being central to the quarrying and the granite industry. Learning about this book that you put out there, you were really talking about, because you know Hardwick very well, that Hardwick actually was the biggest finished granite producer in the world. Is that how it was?
Yes. Well, we say the country, but I think it was the world. The granite, there was a huge deposit of granite in Woodbury, about 7 miles south of the village of Hardwick. Hardwick was on the main railroad line, what was the St. J and LC for a long time, and the granite was not as refined as the Barre granite, but it was a very good quality. It was very uniform, and it was well suited for construction of buildings. And the early 1900s was like a golden age of classical architecture, where they put up new state capitals, city halls, post offices, and the granite from Hardwick was used in many of those buildings, and it really was the leading provider. Its first big contract was for the Pennsylvania State Capitol, which required 400,000 tons of finished stone. So that far exceeded what Barre was doing. Barre was, had monuments and things that were very refined and great artwork. But in terms of volume, Hardwick was way ahead of everybody else unfortunately, for a short period of time, really the time before, from around 1900 until World War I. And then it went into a decline during the 20s and petered out when the Depression came.
Right. Now, how long were you sitting on this story? And
a long time.
A long time. So talk to us a bit about you. And you mentioned also in a previous interview that you're talking about that you just really like to read some of those the historical events through the Hardwick Gazette, and specifically pre-World War I era. What was about that era that really kind of drew you into the stories?
Well, right. So when we bought the paper, we lived right on Main Street above the office, and in the attic there were all these bound volumes of the newspaper, and I liked history, so I turned that into a source of a column going back 5, 10, and 80 years back. And that era was when most things were so much was going on. I mean, it was an industrial town. It was a town that had electricity had was taking over from steam, and they had cutting edge technology for their time.
Mm.
And that allowed them to produce a lot of granite very quickly. They were also a union town, so that attracted workers from Europe and Canada. So they had a lot of skilled workers from Italy who did the fine work. And it was a very successful place, and really the leader in this industry, mainly because of one person who happened to be a great salesman. So he went out and got the contracts, and then he came back and he had very good managers of his company and very good workers, and they produced a great volume.
And so, what made you decide to actually turn this into, as we say, it's a historical fiction? There's a little bit of mystery, and there's a little bit of, as you tell the story a bit. What made you decide to make this as a historical fiction and make a fictionalized town called Granite Junction instead of using Hardwick, and instead of making it into more of a historical book of actually just
Right.
being historical?
Yes. Well, I think novels kind of can give kind of can put emotion into a story and
Mm,
give it lifeblood if the author is successful at doing that. And it's more engaging. And you also the author has to attempt to make you feel like you are there, and that helps the reader a lot as well. I mean, there have been very good histories written about Hardwick. In fact, one of the great resources that I had was from a man named Paul Wood, who was a summer resident in Walden, and he's done exhaustive research on the technology used by the granite companies in Hardwick, as well as the railroad. And
mm.
he mapped out all of the railroad spurs in the village of Hardwick, of which there were like 30. Um,
Wow.
so, but that doesn't tell a story that grabs you. Um, when I started to research it, the the president of the Hardwick Historical Society, another great resource, her name is Wiz Dow, mentioned that there were 30 different companies going in and out of business, but they're in Hardwick and in the granite industry in this time period. But there were two main players, and one was this man George Bickford, who was the great salesman. The other one was the guy who actually first saw the potential for the granite quarry in Woodbury, but um, he lost his financing, and when he came back in, he never caught up to what Bickford was doing, and he became a second fiddle. And Wisdow said, and from what she had read, he didn't like that very much. And and I said, okay, well, there's a start. There's a conflict that I can work with. Um, and but then beyond that, you have to have a protagonist, and you have to have you should have a villain. You have to have boy meets girl, uh, and so this book has those things. Um, and the villain works for the second fiddle producer, and has a real hatred for him, and decides to sabotage his operations, and several deaths
Right.
result from it.
And I believe that the sabotage actually that's actually based off of real historical events, correct?
Well, the accidents are true.
Right.
They weren't sabotaged as far as we know.
Oh, okay.
But they were, yes. Uh, granite is the granite industry was a dangerous industry. People, these huge blocks, if it tipped over, a man would be crushed. All sorts of things can happen. If in the first accident, he cuts a cable, but if a cable breaks, this thing that weighs 20 tons is out of control, and anybody who's in its way is going to get killed.
So you mentioned that you found the time frame you wanted to tell this story. Second to that is when you actually had to create characters and protagonists and
The protagonist is a young reporter for the newspaper, and in addition to the granite industry, this book is a lot about a weekly newspaper in that era. And and of course that draws from my personal experience, but it also reflects the time, the technology at that time, and how things were uh, handled by newspapers. Once I had a villain
Hmm.
whose name is Bob Blackstone. That he kind of drove that storyline. I mean, he was
Okay.
the one
Wow. All right.
who was doing these bad deeds, and it was up to the reporter eventually to try to figure out what was happening. Bob Blackstone, from my point as an author, was always fun whenever I had him on stage because he was going to do something bad. He's going to say something bad. He's a bad guy, but yet he also has a backstory. He had wanted to own a granite company himself, and he kind of got um, taken advantage of and got put behind the eight ball. But he's a very good worker, and
Right.
the second producer, the second fiddle producer, uh, grabs onto him because he's a very good worker, and in that from that position, he's able to do what he does.
So you created the villain first as the first character when you started making the story.
Well, no, I guess the protagonist was I started with
Okay.
him, but it's the villain who drives that storyline.
Okay.
You know, it's what he's doing.
Okay.
I will mention this is an inverted mystery in which after the first chapter, the reader knows who the bad guy is, and the
Okay.
protagonist does not.
Did you end up liking to write for some characters over other characters?
I'll just uh, I was no no
Okay.
I enjoyed them all, but
Okay.
villains, and there are a couple other bad guys too. They're easy to write for because
Hmm.
they're acting badly, and that's kind of that draws our attention. I
Right.
mean, people who are always good guys and never do anything wrong, that's not interesting. But the bad guys are
Right.
interesting.
Did the characters start doing things that you weren't planning on? Did they, or
Oh
were you in
yes,
control the whole
definitely.
time?
No, definitely they start doing things that um, yeah, it is kind of interesting to come up with a situation and try to figure out what they would do, what they would say.
Right. And did you already have an outline in place? Did you know how the book was going to end, even though you said at the beginning you already, as said, like an inverted mystery, the audience, the readers knew who did it, but did you already have planned out how the protagonist was going to solve the mystery?
No, not from the beginning. I mean, I knew that.
Okay.
I guess I knew fairly early on there have to be a confrontation between the protagonist and the villain,
Right.
and they would take place at the granite quarry, um, and then they kind of worked that out at the end later on.
Right. And how difficult was it to you actually to put involve like, all right, because based off of a historical setting, was there something you had to do through developmental editing or having an editor say, actually, what you're bringing up didn't happen yet, or that technology didn't exist quite yet? Or was there some things where you had to like artistic liberties and making sure the story flowed a bit better?
Well, yeah, I mean, you do have to watch out for anachronisms, where using phrases that didn't come up. For instance, I wanted to use a phrase at one point, "California, here I come," from a song, but that was a song from the 20s, so I had to
Okay.
change it. But what I did do was go back during that decade from like 1900 to 1910 and took events that may have happened in 1903 or 1901 and moved them up into this 1 year period that the book takes place in. So yes, I did move some things around, but they were all accurate at their time.
Hmm.
As an example, there was a Chinese laundry in Hardwick in 1900, but there wasn't one in 1910. But I moved it up, and I used it as an example of the racism and prejudice that existed throughout the country and in this town as well.
Right. And because I did see somebody mention though that you didn't what was also omitted in a way was the French Canadian influence during Hardwick at
Uh,
that time.
well, so yes, and yes, like you're good to point that out. And in retrospect, maybe I should have worked a little harder on that. But there, there were very few references to French Canadians.
Okay.
Although in fact there's a murder that takes place that they do solve it, and it is committed by a French Canadian. And this is up in Walden.
Mm,
Um, but so yes, and there was some prejudice against the French Canadians. Uh, Hardwick became a very French Canadian town about 20 years later.
okay. All right. So as you mentioned earlier about some of the anachronisms, was there any phrases or anything in there that you say a modern reader might not understand what this term means, that you wanted to put in that maybe like an editor said, this doesn't make any sense, Eric, or
There may be some terms that they don't understand, but they're very, very few because I didn't want to use terms that I didn't understand.
right. So talk to us a bit about your writing process. So was the Granite Kingdom a book that you actually started writing after you sold the Hardwick Gazette?
Well, yeah, it kind of sat dormant for about 30 years. Um,
Okay.
and actually one of the reasons why I decided to move ahead with it was that I had a bound volume from August 1909 to August 1910 that
Okay.
there had been a second copy in the morgue, the archives that I had bound and I took with me. So I had a very good uh, document to work from. So that
Okay.
was kind of the starting point. And I did frame the book with two historical events that took place. One was the anarchist bombing of the Los Angeles Times in 1909, and there was a fear in the country of anarchism because at that time there were anarchists who were promoting violence in order to take down the government. The president
Mm,
McKinley had been killed by an anarchist in 1901. And then the other incident that I wanted to work in was the shirtwaist factory fire in New York City the following year, in which 30 or 40 women died in a fire, and it really was a shock. And it didn't Hardwick. It did not apply. The workers at Hardwick were well treated, and they were very well paid. And I will say, I will just mention that they had many of the workers, including some in the book, had electricity, running water, indoor plumbing, and
mm,
even some had central heating. And half a mile up the road, the farmer had none of those things. And electricity didn't come to some farms in Vermont, for 20 years later or more.
right.
So in some ways, they had a very good standard of living. But there was a big problem with silicosis. And if you think asbestos is bad, silicosis is with granite dust is even worse. And in the
Oh,
granite sheds, I mean, they were honing down these very hard stones, and there was so much granite dust in the air that they said that the light from the windows up high could not reach the floor because it was so thick. And on the one hand, they were well paid, and the other hand, they really did have some real complaints, and that's mentioned in the book. And um, I think I wanted to get in a lot of this history, which I found fascinating, but I hope it doesn't get in the way of the story that I'm telling, because a novel stands or falls on its storyline.
right. Now, was there anything in your book in your first draft, like you mentioned, it's like a historical event or one piece of history that you really enjoyed that an editor said, you got to cut this out, Eric. It doesn't move the story along.
No, no, that I
Okay.
mean, I guess I mean, certainly there are many sections of the book that I wrote and then discarded.
Mhm.
But so when you get to the publisher, you get a copy editor, and that's the person who would be asking those questions. And a lot of questions were asked, and a lot of changes were made, but nothing substantial like that.
How did you find the time to sit down and actually get this book finished?
Well, I didn't start this until I retired. So, I was kind of interested in writing books in the past, but I just put it aside and didn't quit my day job because I knew I felt I could not make a living at it. And I think I
Right.
was correct. So I retired and then I had the time. And so writers have different methods, but I would just sit every 5 or 6 days a week. I sit down in the morning and I would devote the morning to writing. And I feel that's essential. Some people say you should write 1,000 words um, a day, so I would aim at that. Uh, Although that if I did write 1,000 words, it would be edited 5, 6, 7 times, or discarded. Just saying, oh,
Right.
this didn't work. So there were many days, maybe entire weeks that I was working on something that ultimately didn't get into the book. That does give it a little more depth or it gives me a greater sense of what, even if something ends up just being one paragraph, at least I know the backstory to that paragraph, and that's helpful.
Right, right. And so is it something along the lines where are you long long hand out, or are you somebody that will type it right out and delete, or how does that work for you?
Well, I certainly know of people who, and have heard about people who write longhand. Because I was a journalist, I was used to writing on first a typewriter and then on a computer, and
Right.
I won't do it any other way. And there are other people that dictate it now. You can dictate it, you can have the computer read it back to you, which my wife does, but I don't. So I am old fashioned, but old fashioned now is just using, a laptop. That's old fashioned.
Right. And so as you brought it up with your journalism background, how has that helped you be a good long prose fiction author?
Well, I don't think it helps you with the creativity, or it doesn't help
Okay.
me with the creativity. Certainly think that when you have constantly been writing, and it doesn't necessarily just be journalism. I think it could be true of a lawyer as well, for
Mm,
instance. I think that just the constant habit of working on it. I think journalists are used to editing. I was a writer and an editor, and so a lot of self editing is feels very natural to me.
so when you put out the draft, were you able to find rootstock right away, or how did that work?
I was going the traditional route of trying to get an agent, and my first book I failed to get an agent. Second book, I failed to get an agent. So then I was plan B is to go directly to publishers. And in the case of this book, I said, well, I want to have a Vermont publisher, because that will be the main market and they will have a good feel for the topic. So that's how
Right.
I found Rootstock.
Were they the ones that picked out the cover design and
Yes, they did, and it's interesting. They came up with a couple of they gave me like 5 versions, and I showed it to a bunch of other people, and and a couple of us agreed that we liked one cover that had 2 pictures on it, one of a village and one of the quarries, because that's what this kind of was about.
right?
And Steve MacArthur at Rootstock, he listened to me and said, "Well, that's fine, but we've already decided that it's this one." And he was right. He was right. I acceded to it because I knew he had more experience. But the more I thought about it, I always liked it, but I think it's a great cover. And
Right.
that is the Fletcher, what was called the Fletcher quarry, um, which is actually described like on page 3 of the
Mm.
book, coincidentally.
Why make a fictional town in the first place? Why did you not want to say this is a fictionalized version of Hardwick and kind of give Hardwick that name?
Well, I felt it was important to be fiction. The actors have to be fictional, because as soon as I
Mm.
presume to know how they're going to act in a certain scene, or what they're going to say, or what they're thinking, I mean, it
Right.
has to be fictional. I mean, so this great man who drove this industry, George Bickford. I mean, he's clearly who George Rutherford, the owner of the big company in the book, he's clearly that's who he's based on. But he has to be a different character because,
Right.
I don't know what he was thinking.
Right.
And I'm attributing thoughts to him that maybe are unfair. Now I don't. Well, actually, I mean I do make some suppositions, and he doesn't make mistakes. Um, that it has to be a fictional character. So once you make that decision, well, this has to be a fictional place
Okay.
in my mind,
Right.
even though it's
Right.
clearly Hardwick, and there's a map in the book that's based on Hardwick. I mean, you would recognize it, and I'm sure you do recognize it. And but it and I want the purpose of writing the initial purpose of writing the book was to let people in Vermont know that Hardwick had a real fine history background. I mean, when I was there, Hardwick had a reputation as being a hard scrabble and very rough town. And I don't think that's the case now, but that was the reputation that it had, and yet people didn't realize how successful it had been back in 1910.
Right. And so I'm really curious as well as that is there any, because it takes place in 1910 around that era, pre-World War One, um, is there any desire or drive to maybe tell another story with the same characters, like in say uh, years later?
Well, I told myself that if this book was wildly successful, that I would do a follow-up book to it. And it is an interesting story. But it would be a different kind of challenge because this book is set in 1 year.
Mm,
And we kind of go through the seasons and everything. If something leads, if something, if a question is posed in early in the book, it will be resolved within a year. Hardwick's decline was very slow.
right.
Not that slow, but it would cover a period from 1914 to 1932. And so that would be a real challenge. I mean, how do you, for me anyway, because that's not what I have done. And now I have to do something else, and it would be a
Right.
challenge.
Right.
In Vermont, in Hardwick, I have the newspaper, I have the Hardwick Historical Society, I have this guy named Paul Wood who's done a lot of research.
Right.
I'm just able to put in so much more context and detail than I was in that first book.
And I gotta say what I love about this is that as we mentioned at the top of the show, that you're really touching on a part of Vermont history that not a lot of people are aware of.
Well, it's a fascinating era, and there were a couple of stereotypes that I want in addition to what Hardwick stereotype was. There's another stereotype from that era is in books like The Jungle by Upton Sinclair and other books, all the other books I could find in that era. The main theme is the workers, many of whom are immigrants, are horribly exploited and living in
Mm,
squalid conditions and taken advantage of in every which way. And the owners are fat cats who are just feasting off the profits that they make. And that's not accurate for what happened, what I saw in Hardwick, where the workers are very well paid. Admittedly, the working conditions were dangerous, but they were very well paid. And the owners, they're they're entrepreneurs. They are creating things, and
mm,
they are creating jobs. So it's not black and white. And
right.
yes, they're people, and they have foibles, and they make mistakes. They're not bad people. They're
Right.
good people
Right. Yeah.
to to be admired. And another aspect of it is this is a period of great change. I mean, there is a struggle. Electricity is invented, or the light bulb is invented in 1880, and it takes a while, but the things are constantly changing because of electricity. And there's new equipment, and there are new ways of doing things. Um, Things that have been powered by steam or even horses 10 years earlier is now being driven by electricity. There are new inventions. Uh, the automobile is coming in. Um, there's a character who sells bicycles, and then he sells Kodak cameras, and then he sells Victrolas. But what he really wants to do is sell automobiles. And so you see the change that's taking place, and it's just I found that fascinating.
Now, did you want to read a part of the book?
Well, in terms of electricity, that was one thing I was going to just suggest. And this is basically an editorial, and the editor of the Gazette basically sits around or the Granite Junction Gazette sits around writing editorials, and Dan is the person who actually goes out and does the reporting. And so this is actually an article. I'm going to read something that I edited a little bit. And it's from another newspaper. It was published in the Gazette because the editors would sit around, they'd read all the other papers in the state, and then they would quote some of them, and then they would comment on some of them, and they would have disputes. But I thought this was interesting and kind of sums up kind of what was going on at that era.
Okay.
So this is the editorial. We are privileged to be living in an age of miracles. We assert today that a certain thing is impossible, and we find tomorrow it is an accomplished fact. We act as if the limit has been reached in the world's store of knowledge, and the next day we are knocked breathless by a discovery that revolutionizes existing conditions in some way. Some of us remember when mowing and sewing machines were the epitome of human ingenuity. Now they are as unremarkable as an axe. McCormick's idea for a reaper was jeered at before it revolutionized the agricultural world. Machines for the farm, the shop, the factory, the office, and the household have utterly changed our way of living. These commonplace conveniences would have spooked the elders of our grandparents' youth. Those old Yankees would have climbed the tree if they saw an automobile coming. They would have dropped dead with terror at the sight of an airship. The discovery and application of what we call electricity overshadows all other inventions. But while we have made great progress in harnessing its powers, we still know very little about this marvelous stuff. We don't know where it comes from or where it goes. We don't know any more about electricity than we do about the hereafter. We only know that it is a mighty, invisible force we have managed to apply to a few practical experiences or purposes. What we call electricity, for lack of a better word, will someday bring an end to the ceaseless toil of humanity once future generations gain an understanding of it. It will render labor as we understand it into a bad dream. It will conquer disease and prolong life beyond our present perception. It will greatly increase our pleasures as it expands our knowledge and capacities. We have also heard in recent years about how the internet the internet and computers are going to reduce our work and people won't have to work anymore. Well, it hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Eric. So those that are interested in following you, they can go to ericpopebooks.com. And also ask your local library to get the book as well.
Please do.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Eric. And listen, so you got to come back on when Macedonian Sun comes out, and we'll talk about that.
But it's not a Vermont book, though.
That's fine. That's fine. Yeah.